Bootleg video games have been around for practically as long as video games themselves, and anyone interested in diving into that scene will find an almost limitless amount of hacks, ports, variants, crossovers, and even entirely new titles waiting for them. Given that there is absolutely no quality control for these things, bootleg ROMs can vary from excellent and innovative to poorly made and rushed to bizarre and utterly pointless. You really never quite know what it is you're going to get. It can't be denied that an awful lot of these entirely unlicensed homemade projects are an absolute waste of time and serve very little purpose outside of a few moments of novelty. But today we're going to be looking at one particularly ambitious bootleg for Nintendo's primitive little 8-bit NES console that's definitely worthy of some attention. That's right folks, today we're going to be splashing out on a day saver bus return to Metro City and taking a deep dive look at the bootleg version of the second sequel to Capcom's flagship beat-em-up franchise. Some absolute lunatics out there took it upon themselves to convert this late Super Nintendo game to run on humble 8-bit hardware. I am the Top Hat Gaming Man, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is the illegal 8-bit version of Final Fight 3 for the NES. A true necessity for gracious living. Yeah! We have already extensively covered the Final Fight series and the temperamental little inhabitants of Metro City in great detail on this channel in the past. Hell, I have even uploaded a near movie-length episode compiling the history of the entire franchise, so no need to go into too much detail here. But in regards to this dubious chapter in gaming history, we need to briefly recap on the history of Final Fight 3. Capcom's third entry into their immensely popular and highly influential belt-scrolling brawler franchise was released in December of 1995 to Japan, being released as Final Fight Tough over there. This 16-bit game would slowly be trickled out to the rest of the world by early 1996, late in the Super Nintendo's lifespan. The first entry in the series, which was a hugely successful coin-op arcade machine before it was ported to just about every system you could possibly think of, including even the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC, was available for practically everything under the sun. However, both of the initial Final Fight sequels were developed exclusively for consoles, or more specifically, exclusively for the Super Nintendo. As the SNES port of the first game was lacking the option of 2 players, much to the annoyance of many consumers who purchased it, a new game built from the ground up and making the most of the Super Nintendo's hardware would circumvent this issue, making it an ideal couch co-op experience. This proved to work out well for Nintendo, as both 1993's Final Fight 2 and its successor were big sellers for the platform and received mostly solid reviews, although some critics were starting to tire of the formula by the time the third game rolled around. It was definitely seen as one of Nintendo's highest profile and most marketable franchises around the early 90s, but the rise in popularity of polygon graphics due to the release of all the new CD-based 32-bit Super consoles dulled the shine from the third game somewhat, despite it being one of the most refined beat-em-ups on the entire Super Nintendo platform. The only returning playable character from the first game in Final Fight 2 is series protagonist Mike Hagar, with 2 new characters introduced in the form of Carlos and Maki. Final Fight 3, however, reunites the classic dream team of Guy and Hagar, while also introducing Lucia and Dean into the fold. In regards to this game, what we do know is that despite Final Fight 3 being a favourite amongst die-hard SNES fans, it has received very little love from Nintendo, with no ports, virtual console releases, or official support whatsoever in the 27 years since its release. Which in fairness does seem a little strange that it would be completely overlooked, given that a Wii Virtual Console release was awarded to Final Fight 2 in 2008. But here we are. The fact that there has been no official support or properly licensed ports does not mean that you can't enjoy Final Fight 3 elsewhere though. Which brings us on to the dubious conversion that can be experienced using an NES. If you're a fan of my wife's channel, Lady Decade, you will likely be aware that she has already covered a cornucopia of bootleg NES experiences in the past. Impressively rudimentary versions of the likes of Super Mario World, Earthworm Jim, and Donkey Kong Country can all be played using NES hardware. But more impressively, all of these efforts were produced by the same team. The very same team who have given us the 8-bit version of Final Fight 3. Thanks to the amazing efforts from the rather clever folks over at Taiwanese hacking and development company Hummer Team, a full port of Final Fight 3 was released to the NES in an entirely unofficial and under-the-counter capacity in late 1998. Released by the bootleg publishing brand JY Company, Final Fight 3 is one of the most impressive and completely illegally made Famicom ports you will ever see, as so much of what they do is very much against the law and therefore shrouded in mystery. Details about these types of companies are always a little sketchy, but from what we can gather, the publishers JY Company were in existence from around 1998 to about 2006 or 7. Releasing all manner of games for various systems, but very much specialising in Famicom and NES ports. Most of these companies tend to go through lots of different aliases and fake names, so things can get more than a little confusing when trying to nail down specifics. But they appear to have worked extensively with Hummer, releasing many of their games, but were also pretty active in the early multi-cart market. So they had their fingers in a lot of questionable pies in the 90s. But then again, who didn't? Both Hummer and JY Company were consistently noted within the scene for producing hacks, ports and original games to a much higher standard than what was generally accepted in the community of the period. Many of their releases came on better produced cartridges with high quality chips and PCB boards than what was common, and their multicarts didn't suffer from the prevalence of repeated games that would normally blight such releases. Hummer were particularly noted for being highly skilled when it came to porting games from much more technologically advanced hardware onto systems with much lower specs, a practice that has more recently come to be affectionately known as D-makes. Final Fight 3 for the NES is far more complete when compared to its Super Nintendo big brother than you would ever expect, or that it has any right to be. Astonishingly, all 4 selectable characters from the proper big boy version of the game are all here, warts and all, with the vast majority of bosses and stages also being present. This is one insane effort, so let's take a look at some of the madness that this video game contains. If you are familiar with the original Super Nintendo version of the game, then upon starting this one up you will instantly begin to notice elements that have lovingly been recrafted for the humble hardware. This includes the entire slide and text-based introduction to the game that lays out this adventure's story. Something I instantly noticed though is although it lays out the scenes accurately from the original, the music that is used here and throughout the game seems to have been lifted directly from another Final Fight game. The game I'm talking about is Mighty Final Fight, the Final Fight game that saw an official release on NES and Famicom hardware. Gamers have a choice of playing this one in single player, 2-player co-op or co-op whereby the computer controls the second selectable fighter. After choosing your fighters and picking from one of 4 difficulty settings, action is finally underway. I must say for a beat 'em up running on 8-bit hardware, this title looks very impressive indeed. For years I was under the impression that a beat 'em up on the system with sprites this big and detailed may struggle, hence why Capcom with their own offering would opt for the cutesy looking Mighty Final Fight instead. But by looking at this, it appears that I was wrong. Maybe Hummer Team just know what they're doing a lot better with the hardware than that of Capcom themselves. This isn't just a competently made port, this is a genuinely impressive one. The level of detail offered up for the first stage's backdrop serves as evidence supporting this, with there even being some animation present. Examples of this include the police car's bonnets moving and water spouting from the fire hydrants. The level of detail is top notch. As for the gameplay in this one, Hummer Team did a fairly good job of replicating the action that could be found in the original. However, due to the obvious system limitations, some compromises were obviously needed to make this work. The main difference with this one and its SNES counterpart are the amount of enemies on screen at any one time, and the amount of repeated weaker enemies. These numbers were scaled down significantly to prevent annoying things like slowdown and sprite flicker from getting too egregious during the more intense battles. This results in this version of the game often being considered a fair bit easier than its officially licensed cousin, with battles being far less frantic, and players becoming overwhelmed by big groups of enemies far less frequently. which, looking at this from a positive perspective, at least it gives us a lot of breathing space to be able to take in the beauty and artwork of this forbidden demake gem. As action progresses, like in the source material, characters wander from left to right through riot-damaged dystopian streets until reaching the interior of a prison that serves as the next backdrop for the gameplay. One thing I am yet to note is one particular typo that amused me with this version of the game, with Hagar instead being referred to as Hagar, a typo that makes this gay icon seem all the more alluring. What a handsome man he is. Moving into the third section of the opening stage, the level design continues to mirror that of the original, with the car in the background even having flashing headlights. It's the small details like that that arouse me about this game. The level concludes with the same boss fight from the SNES version taking place too, a boss fight against the muscled up, corrupt police officer known as Dave, who must be vanquished to progress the story. The game's cutscenes continue to be recreated in between stages, with each level continuing to contain a great amount of detail as we make headway. Look at this old weathered wall for example on the second stage. That's a lot of effort for a bootleg, and a title that many Western gamers would just scoff at, rather than trying. Soldiering on from stage to stage, you will continue to be wowed and impressed with the fact that each one seems to be as lovingly crafted and demade as well as the next, which makes it all the more surprising when I read up on bootleggames.fandom.com that apparently the development of this one was rushed. In an interview with Hummer Cheng, someone who worked on this game and other Hummer team efforts, they note that Final Fight 3 for the Famicom was rushed out as quickly as possible, as Famiclones were declining in popularity across Taiwan. But looking at what is on offer with this game, Hummer team could certainly have fooled me. There is however one notable difference with this game and most other produced by the Taiwanese developers that does illustrate the rush job portion of this tale, and that would be the game's music. As noted earlier, the game utilises music from Mighty Final Fight, created by Capcom's sound engine, whereas with the majority of their games, they tend to usually use their own sound engine. Also, while in the Super Nintendo version of the game, each character has their own specific endings with this one. No matter who you complete the game as though, only Dean's ending can be played in the NES version. More endings could have possibly been another feature they may have implemented if the team had given more time to this. Branching paths and a super meter also appear to be missing, two of the new features that Capcom would bring to Final Fight 3 that would not be included with earlier entries in the series. Despite its obvious limitations, I must say that Final Fight 3 for the NES is a lot stronger game than I was expecting, and is perhaps the most graphically impressive side-scrolling beat-em-up that is available on 8-bit Nintendo hardware. There is a lot of Final Fight 3 content packed into this package, with the Taiwanese bootleggers creating something rather amazing, especially when we consider the time pressures the team were apparently under. What a bloody game! So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the illegal Final Fight 3 for the NES. Be sure to let me know down in the comment section whether you are familiar with any beat-em-ups that look as impressive as this one, be it in an officially licensed capacity or not. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, then watch my other recent upload on the Street Fighter 2 NES bootleg. Cheerio!